Enjoy tonight's story, which is the Banshee's Comb, also known as Banshee's Halloween. This is the same Darby O'Gill of Disney fame, but it's not the story in the movie. Darby O'Gill finds the end part of a comb that later turns out to belong to a banshee. That's why I sat like this. In her attempts to locate the missing piece, the phantom woman summons up a host of ghosts from the graveyard to sweep through the countryside and towns looking for it. If you want to know how Darby O'Gill escapes, well, stick around. And just to note, it is exactly 1/3 of the way to Halloween tonight. Isn't that exciting? I throw you one more link here, which I should have had ready, but I didn't. If you'd like to read along, here's the link to read along with, and we'll be starting on page 203 tonight. I get a song in my head. Yes, tonight's story is just a wee bit long, possibly by 8:20 or so. We should have it wrapped up. And this is only part 1, with part 2 being on Thursday night. And I'm not trying to make it any longer. But real quick, I want to give you a little backstory because, well, I'm like that. Sometime previous to 1891, when Patrick Barton published an account of it, by the way, I'll give you a link to that book later if you like, by Patrick Barton, Some Legends of Scary Creatures of County Meath. A youth had the temerity to steal a comb from a banshee. Now, banshees are an Irish entity that's said to sing laments for people before they die, and for the crime of stealing the banshee's comb, the youth was haunted and driven by her phantom, keening and wailing until he was almost dead, at which time she gave the young lad the opportunity to return the comb to her. Now, interestingly, this account from early 1800s sometime was listed as an anomaly, and the author claimed that this account was a true story. Now, the author, Patrick Barton himself, certainly believed in the existence of banshees, having stated, "The most authentic account I ever heard describes her as of dwarfish stature, golden hair, dressed in a red skirt, and devoid of feet." Well, the story of the youth and the comb was likely to have inspired Hermione Kavanagh, the author of Darby O'Gill and the Good People. Now, this part's true, as, well, all of it is, I guess. I have a friend in County Meath, an older friend, who remembers being warned by her grandmother never to pick up a strange comb lying on the ground because a banshee might be waiting to spirit away the fool who touches it. And my own dear Irish nanny cautioned me as a wee lad not to pick up a comb from the ground. Now, I assumed it's because it was dirty with who knows whose cooties on it, right? And she told me, yes, that, but also other reasons. At the time, unspecified reasons. And another aspect of the Banshee legend says that the Banshee would only wail for a member of one of the 5 ancient Irish families: the O'Neills, the O'Briens, the O'Connors, the O'Gradys, and the Kavanaghs. Well, that's it. On with the story. Chapter 1, The Diplomacy of Bridget. 'Twas the mending of clothes that All Souls afternoon in Elizabeth Ann Egan's kitchen that naturally brought up the subject of husbands and the best ways to manage them. And if there's one thing more than another that makes me take me hat off to the women, 'tis the audacious way the most downtrodden of their sex will brag about their blackguard husband. Not that either one or the other of the 5 busy-tongued and busy-fingered neighbour women who bent about their sewing or knitting that afternoon were downtrodden, by no manner of means, far from that. They were so filled with matrimonial contentedness that they fairly trampled down one another to be first in praising the wonderful men of their choice, their blackguard husband, that is. Each and every woman there proudly claimed to own and control the handsomest, likeliest man that ever trod in brogues. Then they talked so fast, they talked so loud, and it was trying a long while before meek-voiced little Margaret Doyle could squeeze her husband, Daniel John, sideways into the argument. And even when she did get him to the fore, the other women had appropriated all the heroic qualifications for their own husbands, so there was nothing left for Daniel but the common levens, and that deprivation settled Margaret and vexed her sore. But she took her chance when it came, poor as it was, and bolted in. Jabbing the air as though her needle were a dagger, Margaret broke into the discourse. I wouldn't trade my Dan for the King of Russia or the Emperor of China, says she, peering defiant around the room. No one sided with that remark, and no one argued against it, and this vexed her all the more. The kingdom of China is where the most superior tea comes from, says Cecilia Crow. Now, Cecilia was a large and solemn woman, was Mistress Crow, and a great historian. No, I wouldn't, continued Margaret, scorning the interruption. Not if the two men were rolled into one. Why, says Cecilia Crow, and her deep voice tolled like a passing bell. Why, says she, should any decent woman be wanting to marry one of them heathen emperors like? Sure, they're all ambiguous, she says, looking around proud of the grand word, ambiguous. Now Elizabeth Ann stopped the spinning wheel for Better to listen, while the others turned unbothered faces to the historian. Ambiguous, says Mistress Crow, raising her voice in the middle part of the word. Ambiguous, she says again, means that according to the legal laws of some of them foreign parts, a man may marry 4 or 5 wives if he has a mind to. Now at this Margaret bristled up like a bantam hen. Do you mean to say to me, Cecilia Crow, says she, dropping in her lap the waistcoat she was mending, do you intend to substantiate that I'm wishing to marry the Emperor of China, or, she says, her voice growing high and cutting as an east wind, do you wish to inferentiate that if my Daniel had the lave he'd be ambiguous? Will you please tell these friends and neighbours, she says, waving a hand, which of the two of us you was minded to insinuate against? Now, the attack by Margaret was so sudden and so unexpected that Mistress Crow was too bewildered to defend herself, and the poor woman only sat staring stupid at Margaret. Now, the others sunk back in their chairs, speechless with consternation, till Molly Scanlon, wishing to pacificate the situation and winking friendly at Cecilia, so spoke up soothing-like. Well, it's true for you, Margaret Doyle, says she. What kind of talk is that for you to be talking, Cecilia? If Daniel John were to be made the Emperor of China tomorrow, he'd hesitate and deliberate a long time before bringing in one of them ambiguous women. To you and the children, I know, I'd like to see him try it. And it'd be sore and powerful day for him, I'm thinking. Now, at them words, Margaret, in her mind's eye, saw Daniel John standing for an instant with an ambiguous heathen woman on each side of him, and the picture riled the blood in her heart. Oh-ho! Says Margaret, turning on poor shrinking Molly with a smile, and that smile had loaded guns and pistols in it. And will you please be so kind and condescending, Mistress Scanlon, says Margaret, to explain what you ever saw or heard tell of in my Daniel John's actions, and it make you think he'd contemplate such a scoundrel endeavours as that, she says, beginning to tremble. Now the only answer to the question was from the tea kettle. It was singing high and impotent on the hob. Now, Bridget O'Gill, knowing woman that she was, had wisely kept out of this discourse. And Bridget sat apart, calmly knitting one of her dear Darby's winter stockings. As Bridget listened in, howsomever, she couldn't keep back a sly smile that lifted one corner of her mouth. Isn't it a poor and pitiful case, says Mistress Doyle, glaring savage from one to the other, that a decent man, the father of 9 children, 8 of them living and 1 gone for a soldier, isn't it a burning shame, she says, whimpering, that such a decent man must have his character traduced before his own wife. Will you be so good as to tell me what you're laughing at, Bridget O'Gill, ma'am? Now Bridget, fluttering guiltily, tried to hide the misfortunate smile, but was too late. Because, Bridget, if it is my husband you're mocking at, says Margaret, let me tell you fair and plain, his equals don't live in the county of Tipperary, let alone in this parish. 'Tis true, she says, tossing her head. He hasn't spent 6 months with the good people. Aye, he knows nothing of the fairies, like your husband. But he has more sense than those that have, At any rate, he is not afeard of ghosts like a knowledgeable man that I could mention. Now, that last thrust touched a sore spot in the heart of Bridget O'Gill. Although Darby O'Gill would fight 12 living men if needful, 'twas well known that he had an unreasonable fear of ghosts. And so Bridget said never a word, but her brown eyes began to sparkle, and her red lips were drawn up to the size of a button. Margaret saw how hard she'd hit, and she went on triumphant. My Daniel John is sleeping in the churchyard. He's done it, she says, a crowing. Now Bridget O'Gill could hold in no longer. Well, I'd be sore and sorry, says she, if a husband of mine were drove to do such a thing as sleep in the churchyard, all for the sake of a little peace and quiet, she says, turning her shoulder. Now, tearing hounds, but that was the stroke. "Oh, the Lord bless us," muttered Molly Scanlon. Margaret's mind went up in the air and stayed there whirling whilst she herself sat gasping and panting for a reply. 'Twas a thrilling, suspenseful minute, I'll tell you. The Chinese shepherd and the shepherdess on the mantel stopped goggling, and their eyes looked shocked at each other. At the same time, Bob, the linnet, in his wooden cage at the door, quit his singing and cocked his head the better to listen, and the surprised tea-kettle gave a gasp and a gurgle and spluttered over the fire. In the terrible silence, Elizabeth Egan got up to wet the tea, setting the teapot on the fender as she spoke, and she spoke resentful-like. "Any sensible man is afeard of ghosts," says she. "Oh, indeed," said Margaret, catching her breath. "Is that so? Well, sensible or unsensible, this will be Halloween, And there's not a man in the parish would walk past the churchyard up to Cormac McCarthy's house where the Banshee keened last night, except in my Dannel," says she, triumphant. Now, the hurt pride in Bridget O'Gill rose at that and forced her from her angry lips a foolish promise. "Ho! We hear ducks talking," says Bridget, coolly rowling up Darby's stocking and sticking a needle in the ball of yarn. "This very afternoon, I'll have you know, I was up at Cormac McCarthy's, and there wasn't a bit of tea in the house for poor little Eileen, so I promised Cormac I'd send him a handful. Now, by the same token, I promise you my Darby will make no bones of going on that errand this night." "Ho, ho, ho! Is that right?" laughed Margaret. "If he has the courage to do it, bid him stop in to me on his way back, and I'll send you a fine setting of eggs for my black Spanish hen." Well, what sharp word Mistress O'Gill would have flung back in answer, no one knows. Because when once provoked, she has the few equals for sarcastic language. But just as when Elizabeth Ann put in Bridget's hand a cup of steaming good strong tea. Now, whiskey, ale, and porter are all good for enough in their places, Your Honour, and I've nothing to intimidate against them, but for a comforting, soothing, edifying beverage, give me a cup of fine black tea. So this day the cups were filled only the second time, when the subject of husbands was completely dropped and the conversation wandered to the misdemeanours of Anthony Sullivan's goat. Now, all this time the women had been so busy with their talking and argufying that the creeping darkness of a coming storm had stolen unnoticed into the room, making the fire glow brighter and redder on the hearth. A faint flare of lightning, followed by a low grumble of thunder, brought the women to their feet. "Oh, mercy on us," says Cecilia Crowe, glad of an excuse to be gone. "Do you hear that? We'll all be drowned before we reach home," says she. Now in a minute there was the visitors, and after draining their cups were out in the road, each hurrying on their separate way and tying her bonnet strings as she went. 'Twas a heavy and guilty heart that Bridget carried home with her through the gathering storm. Although Darby was intimate friends with the fairies, yet, as Margaret Doyle said, Darby did have a black dread of all other kinds of ghosts that to get him out on this threatening Halloween night. To walk past the churchyard, as he must do on his way to Cormac McCarthy's cottage, was a job equal to the lifting of the Shandon Bridge it was. Now, how she was to manage it, she couldn't for the life of her tell. But if the errand was left undone, she'd be the laughing stock of every woman in the parish. But worst of all, and what cut Bridget's heart the sorest, was that she had turned an act of neighbourly kindness into a vainglorious boast, and that she doubted not was a mortal sin. Bridget had promised Cormac in the afternoon that as soon as she got home she would send Darby over with some tea for poor little Eileen. And now a big storm was gathering, and before she could have supper ready, try as hard as she could, a black night might be upon them. To bring ease to the dying, is the comfortingest privilege a man or woman can have. And now I've traded it for a miserable setting of eggs, Bridget says to herself. Am not I the unfortunate creature, she thought, to have to let me pride ruin me this way? Oh, what will I do at all, she cried. Bad luck to the thought that took me out of my way to Elizabeth Ann Egan's house. And then Bridget made a wish that she might be able to get in home in time to send Darby on his errand before the night came on. Oh, well, if the girls all laugh at me, that'll be my punishment, won't it? And maybe it'll clean my sin, she thought. But Bridget's wish was in vain. For just as she crossed the stile to her own field, the sun dropped behind the clouds and the hills, as though it had been shot, and the east wind swept up, carrying with it a sky full of black clouds and rain. Now, that same All Souls night, Darby O'Gill, the friend of the fairy, sat as he had often sat before, amidst the dancing shadows, ferninst his own crackling turf and wood fire, listening to the storm beat against his cottage windows. Little Mickey, his 6-year-old, cuddled asleep on his daddy's lap, while Bridget sat beside him. The other children cuddled around her. Oh my, how the rain powered and hammered and swirled. Out of the highway, the big drops smashed against wayfarers' faces like blows from a fist, and once in a while, over the flooded moors and the far row of lonesome hills, a sullen lightning spurtled red and angry like a vicious flare of a volcano. Now, you may well say 'twas perfect weather for Halloween. Tonight, when the spirits of the departed dead visit once again their homes and sit unseen, listening and yearning about the old hearthstones. More than once that evening, Darby shivered and shuddered at the wild shrieks and wails that swept over the chimney tops, he being certain sure that it was not the wind at all, but despairing voices that cried out to him from the cold lips of the dead. At last, after one particular doleful cry that rose and fell and lingered around the roof, the knowledgeable man raised his head and fetched a deep breath and said to his wife Bridget, "Oh, do you hear that, Afther? The dear Lord be merciful to the souls of the departed." Bridget turned a troubled face toward Darby. "Oh, amen," Bridget says, speaking softly. "And may he preserve them who are dying this night. Oh, poor Eileen McCarthy, and she the purty light-footed Colleen only married her for the few months, Haven't we the reasons to be thankful and grateful to you and I, Darby, We can never pray enough, Darby," says she. Now, the family just got off their knees from their night prayers that had lasted half an hour, so them last words worried Darby greatly. That woman," Darby says to himself, mighty sour, referring to Bridget, of course. "That woman is this minute contemplating and insinuating that we haven't said prayers enough for Eileen, when as it is, me 2 poor knees have blisters on them as big as hens' eggs from kneeling, and if I don't look out," Darby says to himself again, "she'll put the children to bed, and then she's down on her knees for another hour, and me with her. Oh, I'd never advise anyone to marry such a pious woman. I'm fairly kilt with religion, so I am. I must distract her mind and prevent her intentions," Darby says to himself. "Hey, maybe, Bridget," Darby says out loud as he was readying his pipe. "Maybe it ain't so bad after all for Eileen. If we keep hoping for the best, we'll chase the worst out of a few good hours at any rate," says the knowledgeable man. But Bridget only rolled the apron about her folded arms and shook her head sorrowful at the fire. Darby squinted carefully down the stem of his pipe, blew in it, and took a sly glance at his wife, and went on. "Don't you remember, Bridget," Darby says, "when old Mrs. Rafferty lay sick of a bad inflammation of the stomach, Well, the Banshees sat for a full hour keening and crying before their house, just as it did last night outside Corbin McCarthy's. And you know the Banshee cried but once at Rafferty's, but never returned for the second time. The information left Julia, and all the wide world knows, even the King of Spain might know if he'd sent an axe, that Julia Rafferty, as strong as a horse, was digging potatoes in her own field as late as yesterday." "The Banshee comes 3 nights before anyone dies, doesn't it, Daddy?" says little Mickey, waking up all excited. "Oh, it does that," says Darby, smiling proud of the child's knowledgeableness. "And it's come but once to Eileen McCarthy." Now, the clever listeners among you may ask why the Banshee would wail for a McCarthy. Well, truth be told, Eileen is a Kavanagh on her mother's side, you see. And while the Banshee cries, she sits combing her hair with a comb of gold, don't she, Daddy? Bridget sat uneasy, biting her lips. Always and ever she had strove to keep from the childer tidings of fairies and banshees and ghosts and other unnatural people. Twice she thrown a warning look at Darby, but he not noticed and went on stroking the little lad's hair and saying to him, "Aye, it does indeed, Averick. And as she came but once to Mrs. Rafferty's, we have reason to hope she'll come no more to Cormac McCarthy's for Eileen." "You hush that noise," says Bridget, looking daggers. "Sure, Jack Doolan says 'twas no banshee at all come to Rafferty's, but only himself who had taken a drop too much at the fair, and on his way home he sat down to rest himself by Rafferty's door. He says that he started singing pious hymns to keep off the evil spirit, and everyone knows that same Jack Doolan has a terrible voice for singing, as any banshee that ever twisted a lip," says Bridget. Now the woman's contrariness vexed Darby, so he pounded his knee with his fist as he answered his wife. "Well, you'll not deny, maybe," he says, "that the coast of Bowers stopped one night at the Hall, and—" "Whish, whish, whish," said Bridget. "You leave off now, Darby. Sure, that's no kind of talk to be talking this night before the childers." "But, Mammy, I know what the coast of Bowers is," cried little Mickey, sitting up straight in Darby's lap and pointing his finger at his mother. "'Tis I that knows well. The coast of Bower is a great black coach that comes in the night to carry the Crogamaha, the dead people that the Banshee keened for." The other children by now were sitting bolt upright, stiff as ramrods, and staring wild-eyed at Mickey. "The coachman's head is cut off, and he holds the reins in this-a-way," says the lad, letting his hands fall limp and open at his sides. "Sometimes it's all visible, and then again it's invisible, but always when it comes to one can hear the terrible rumble of its wheels." And Mickey's little voice fell, and spreading out his hands, he spoke slow and solemn. "In one Halloween night in the woods down at the Black Pond, Danny Hogan heard it coming, and he jumped behind a stone. The trees couldn't stop it, and they went right through it, and it passed Danny Hogan, and he says he saw one white dead face leaning back against the dark cushions, and this is the night. All Souls' Night it is, when it's sure to be out. Now don't I know?" he says, triumphant. At that, Bridget started to her feet. For a minute she stood speechless with vexation at the wild, frightening notions that had got into the heads of her children. And then, "Glory be," says Bridget, looking hard at Darby. "You could have heard a pin drop in the room." Old Malachi, the big yellow cat, who until this time lay coiled asleep on a stool, was the best judge of Bridget's character in the house. So no sooner did he hear the words and see Bridget start up than he was on his own 4 feet, his back arched, his tail straight up, and his 2 golden eyes searching for her face. One look was enough for him. The next instant Malachi leapt to the ground and started for the far room. As he scampered through the door, he threw a swift look back at his comrades, the children. And that look said plain as any words could say, "Run for it while you've the time. Follow me. Some of you vagabonds has done something murdering." And Malachi was right. There would have been serious trouble for all hands, only that a softening thought on Bridget that night which sobered her temper. She stopped a bit, the frown on her face cleared as she looked at the children, then she only said, "Come out of this, yous. Back to bed with yous. I'm raising a pack of audacious young romancers, and I didn't even know it. Mickey, you stop that whimpering and make haste with your clothes. The Lord help us, he's broke off another button. Look at that now," she says. Yeah, there was no help for them. And so with longing looks thrown back at their father, sitting cosy before the fire, and with consoling winks and nods from him, the children followed their mother to the bedroom. And then whilst Bridget was tucking the covers about them and hushing their complainings, Darby, with his elbows on his knees, doing in his head a sum in figures, and that sum was this: how much would it be worth, this All Souls' Night, for a man to go out that door and walk past the churchyards up to Corrant McCarthy's, the stonecutter's house? Now at one time Darby made the answer in his head as low as £10, 2 shillings, and a threepence. But as he did so, a particular loud blast went shrieking past outside in the storm, and he raised the answer to £1,520 sterling, and cheap at that, Darby said aloud. Now while Darby was studying them sagacious questions, Bridget stole quietly behind him and put a light hand on his shoulder. Now, for a minute then, neither of them said a word. Surprised at the silence, and puzzled that little Mickey had escaped a larruping, Malachi crept from the far room and stood in the still doorway judging his mistress. An expression was on her face, and the cat could not quite make it out. 'Twas an elevated, pitying, good-hearted, determined look, such as a man may wear when he goes into the sty to kill one of his own pigs for Christmas. And Malachi, being a wise and experienced beast, decided to take no chances, so he backed through the door again and he hid under the dresser to listen. "I was just thinking, Darby, Avernine," says Bridget, half whispering. "I was just thinking how we might this blessed night earn a great credit for our 2 souls." "Wait now," says the sly man, straightening himself and raising a hand. "The very thing you're going to spake was on my mind, my dear. I was just deliberating that I hadn't done justice tonight to poor Eileen. I haven't said me prayers fervent enough, and I never can when we're praying together or when I'm kneeling down here. And then, like everywhere else, there's something queer about me. The finest prayers I ever say is when I'm, by myself alone in the fields," says the conniving villain. "So do you, Bridget. You go in and kneel down by the children there for half an hour or so, and I'll sit here doing my best. If she should happen to look out at me, you might easily think that I was only sitting here comfortably smoking my pipe. At the same time, prayers will be whirling inside of me like a windmill," says Darby. Oh, then, Darby, ain't I glad and happy to hear you say them words, says his wife, putting one fine arm about his neck. You've taken a load off my heart that's been weighing on it all night, for I thought maybe you'd be afeard. Afeard of what? Asked Darby, lifting his eyebrows. Malachi trotted boldly up and jumped up on the stool. Well, Darby, you know what Father Cassidy says, whispered Bridget. That a loving deed of the hands done for the distressed is itself a prayer worth a week of common prayers. I've nothing again that saying, says Darby, his head cocked and growing suspicious. Bridget wiped her forehead with her apron. Well, Darby, love, this afternoon I was at the McCarthy's house, she went on, soothing his hair with one hand. And oh, the poor child Eileen was so distressed. Her cheeks were flaming with the fever. And Darby, the thirst, the awful thirst. Well, I looked about for a pinch of tea. There's nothing so cooling for one in the fever as a cup of weak tea, you know, and the sorest scrap of it was in their house. And so, Darby, love, I told Cormac that tonight, as soon as the children were in bed, I'd send you over with a pinch of tea. Now, every one of Darby's 4 bones stiffened and a mortal chill struck into his heart. Now listen, darling, says Bridget. The storm's dying down, it is. And so while you're putting on your greatcoat, I'll wrap up the bit of tea. Darby shook her hand from his shoulders. Woman, says he with bitter politeness, I think you said that we had a great chance to credit for our 2 souls. That's what I think your remark stipulated, says Darby. Oh, shouldn't a woman have great praise and credit who will send her husband out on such a night as this, Bridget says. The worse conditions, the more credit she'll be getting. If a ghost were to jump out at you, Darby, as you go past the churchyard, oughtn't I be the happy woman entirely, says Bridget. Now there was a kind of tinkle in her voice, such as comes when Bridget is telling jokes. So Darby, with a sudden hope in his mind, turned quick to look at her. But there Bridget stood, grim and unfeeling and determined as a pointed gun. Oh, ho! Is that the way it is, then? Darby says. Well, here's luck and good fortune to the ghost or skeleton that lays his hands on me this blessed night. He stuck his 2 hands deep in his pockets and whirled one leg across the other, the most aggravating thing a man can do. But Bridget was not the least discouraged and only made up her mind to come at him on his soft side, so she spoke up and said, Oh, Darby, suppose I was dying of the fever, Darby O'Gill, and Cormac refused to bring over a pinch of tea to me. What then would you think of the stonecutter? Now Malachi, the cat, remember Malachi? Malachi stopped licking his paws and thrown a sharp inquiring eye at his master. Bridget, says the knowledgeable man, giving his hand an argifying wave, we have 2 separate ways of being good. Your way is to scurry around and do good acts. My way is to keep from doing bad ones, you see. And who knows, Darby says with a pious sigh, which way is the better one? It isn't for us to judge, says he, shaking his head solemn at the fire. Bridget walked out in front of him and folded her arms tight. So, you won't go then, she says, sharp and sudden. The devil a foot, says Darby, beginning to whistle to himself. Now you'd think, now, the Bridget was beat, but she still held her trump card, and until that was played and lost, the lad wasn't safe. All right, me brave hero, says Bridget. Do you sit there by the fire, and I'll go myself, she says. With that, she bounced into the children's room, and she began to get ready her cloak and hood. For a minute, Darby sat poking the fire, muttering to himself and feeling very discommodious. And then, just to show he wasn't least bit uneasy, the lad cleared his throat and, wagging his head at the fire, he began to sing, As I walked out one morning, all in the month of June, the primroses and the daisies and cowslips were in bloom. I spied a purty fair maid a-strolling on the lea, and Rory Borealis, nor any other old ancient heathen goddess was not so fair as she. Says I, me purty fair maid, I'll take you for me bride, and if you pay no attention. Glancing up sudden, he saw Malachi's eye on him, and if ever the features of a cat spoke silent but plain language, Malachi's face talked that minute to its master Darby. And this is what it said. Well, of all the cowardly, creaking bostings I ever see in all me born days, you are the worst, Darby O'Gill. You not only give impudence to your wife, and she's worth 4 of you, but you've gone back on the friends you pretended to. Malachi's features got no further in the insulting remarks, for at that Darby swooped up a big sod of turf and let it fly at the audacious beast. Now, it is well known that Be a spontaneous throw like that, no one ever yet hit a sensible cat. But always and ever in that unlucky endeavour he strikes a damager blow, though it is not intended. And so it was this time. Bridget, wearing her red cloak and hood, was just coming through the door, and that misfortunate sod of turf caught her fair and square right below the chest, and she staggered back against the wall. Darby's consternation and complication, interpretation were beyond imagination. Bridget lay there gasping. If she felt as bad as she looked, 4 Dublin surgeons with their saws and knives could not have done a ha'porth of good. Howsoever, for all that, the sly woman had seen Malachi dodge and go galloping away. But Bridget pretended to think 'twas at herself the turf was thrown from Darby. Not that she scolded or anything so common as that, but she went on like an early Christian martyr who was just going to be introduced to the roaring lions. Well, as you may easily see, the poor man, her husband, hadn't a chance in the world after that. And of course, to ratify himself, he'd face all the ghosts in Croagh-Maha. And so, in a minute, he was standing in his greatcoat with his hands on the latch. There was a packet of tea in his pocket, and Darby was a subdued and conquered man altogether. And so woeful, he looked so woeful that Bridget repented and almost relented. "Now, remember, Darby Averney," she says mournful, "if I'm caught this... yes, if I'm caught this night by the coast of Bower, or by the Banshee," says Darby, "you take good care of the children now, Bridget, and you remember what I say. I didn't mean, Bridget, I didn't mean to hit you with that sort of turf." "Oh, ain't you the foolish darling to be afeard?" smiled Bridget back at him, but she was serious, too. "Don't you know that when one goes on an errand of mercy, a score of God's white angels with swords in their hands march before him, beside him, and after him, keeping his path free from dangers?" And with that, Bridget pulled his face down to hers, and she kissed him as she used to, back in the old courting days. Yeah, well, there's nothing but so much high courage and clear, steadfast purpose in a man's heart, if it be properly given, as a kiss from the woman he loves. And so, with the warmth of that kiss to cheer him, Darby set forth into the storm. Chapter 2, The Banshees' Halloween. Halloween night. To all unhappy ghosts, it is about the same as St. Patrick's Day is to you or to me. 'Tis a great holiday in every churchyard, and no one knew this better or felt it keener than did Darby O'Gill on that same Halloween night, as he stood in his own doorstep with a paper of black tay for Eileen McCarthy safely stowed away in the crown of his top hat. And no one in that barony was quicker than he in an act of neighbourly kindness, but now as he huddled himself together in the shelter of his own eaves, and the thought of the dangers before, and of the cheerful fire and comfortable bed he was leaving behind, black rebellion rushed shouting across his heart. Oh my, what a perishing night to turn a man out into," he says. "It'd be half a comfort to know I was going to be killed before I got back, just a word into Bridget." The mistreated lad turned a sour eye in the tumultuous weather, and he groaned deep as he pulled closer about his shoulders the cape of his greatcoat, and he plunged into the deserted and flooded roadway. Howsoever, it was not the pelting rain, nor the lashing wind, nor yet the pitchy blackness that bothered the heart out of him as he went splashing and stumbling along the road. A thought of something more relentless than the storm, more mysterious than the night's blackness, put pounds of lead into the lad's unwilling brogues. For somewhere in the shrouding darkness that covered McCarthy's house, the Banshee was waiting this very minute, perhaps ready to jump out at him as soon as he came near. No. If the Banshee nabbed him there, what in the world would the poor lad do to save himself? At the realization of this situation, the goose-flesh crept up his back and settled on his neck and shoulders. He began to cast about in his mind for a bit of cheer, a scrap of comfort, as a man in such circumstances will. And so, grumbling and sore-hearted, Darby turned over Bridget's parting words. "Darby, if one goes on an errand of mercy," Bridget had said, "a score of God's white angels with swords in their hands march before him and beside him and after him, keeping his path free from danger." And so Darby felt anxious in his hat for a bit of charitable tea he was bringing. He was glad to find it there, safe and dry enough, and though the rest of him was drenched through and through, much like Brick's whiskey. "Hey, isn't this an act of charity I'm doing to be bringing a cooling drink to a dying woman?" he asked himself aloud. "To be sure it is. Well then, what reason have I to be afeard?" says he. poking his two hands into his pocket. "Arrah, it's easy enough to bolster up one's heart with a wise saying and heroic precepts, and sitting commodious by one's own fire, but talking wise words to oneself is mighty poor comfort when you're on the lonely high road of a Halloween night with a churchyard waiting for you at the top of the hill not 200 yards away. There's only one star to break through the thick sky and shine for him. It was there with one friendly cow and a low or a distant cock to break the teeming silence. 'Twould put some heart into that man. But no, the sound was there, only the swish and wailing of the wind, the invisible hedges. Ah, what's the matter with the whole world? Where's it all vanished to? Says Darby. If a ghost were to jump at me from the churchyard wall, where would I look for help? To run is no use, he says, and to face it is. And just then the current of his misdoubtings ran whack up against a saying of old Peggy O'Callaghan. Mrs. O'Callaghan's reputation for truth and veracity when it come to fairy tales or ghost stories, be it known, was equal if not superior to the best in Tipperary. Now, Peggy O'Callaghan had told Ned Mullen, and Ned Mullen had told Bill Donoghue, the tinker, and the tinker had advised Darby that no one need ever be afeard of ghosts if he only had the courage to face them. Peggy said, "Oh, the poor creatures ain't roaming about shaking chains and moaning and groaning just for the sport of scaring people, nor yet out of meanness. It is always a trouble that's on their minds, you see. A message they want sent, a secret they're endeavouring to unload. So instead of flying from the poor unhappy ghost things, as most people generally do, one should walk up to the bold apparition and be it gentle or common, male or female, and say, 'Oh, what troubles you, sir? What's amiss with you, ma'am?' And take my word for it," says Peggy O'Callaghan, "you'll find yourself a benefactor to them when you least expect it." It was a queer idea, to be sure, but not so unreasonable after all when one comes to think of it, and the knowledgeable man fell to deliberating whether he had have the hardness to folly it out if the chance came. Sometime he thought he would, and then again he thought sure that he wouldn't. For Darby O'Gill was one who bent quicker under trouble, like a young tree before a hurricane, but he only bent, and the trouble never broke him. So at times his courage went down to a sparkle like the light of a candle in a gust of wind. Before you turn your heel, he was up, blazing strong and fiercer than ever before. Whilst thus contemplating and meditating, his foot struck the bridge in the hollow just below the burying ground. And there, as the boy paused a minute, turning up bravery enough to carry him up the hill and past the mysterious gravestones, there came a short quiver of lightning, and its sudden flare he was sure he saw not 10 yards away, coming down the hill toward him, a dim shape that took the breath out of his body. "Oh, by the powers!" he gasped, his courage emptying out like water from a spilt pail. It moved, a slow, grey, formless thing without a head, and so far as he was able to judge it might be about the size of an elephant. The persecuted lad swung himself sideways in the road, one arm over his eyes and the other stretched out at full length as if to ward off this terrible visitor. And the first thing that began to take any shape in his bewildered brain was Peggy O'Callaghan's advice. Darby tried to follow it, but as a chattering of teeth was the only sound he made, and all this time a tremendous splashing like the flopping of whales was coming nearer and nearer to him, and the splashing stopped not 3 feet away, and the haunted man felt in the spine of his back and in the calves of his leg a powerful unholy monster towered over him, and why he didn't swoon in his tracks is the wonder. He says he would have dropped at last if it weren't for the distant bark of his own good dog Caesar, that put a throb of courage into Darby's bones, and that friendly sound he opened his 2 dry lips and he uttered this saying, "However you are, whatever your shape you come in, you take heed that I'm not afeard of you. I'm not, and I command you to tell me your troubles. I'll be your benefactor, I will, and then you go back decent and respectable where you're buried. You speak, and I'll listen," says Darby. He waited for reply, and getting none, a hot splinter of shame at being so badly frightened turned his soul into vexation. "Speak up," says Darby, "but come no further, for if you do but a hokey, I'll take one try at you, ghost or no ghost," says Darby. Once more he waited, and as he was lowering his arm from his eyes for a peek, the ghost spoke up, and his answer came in 2 pitiful, distressed roars. "Oh." A damp breath puffed across his face and opened his eyes. What should the lad see but the 2 drooping ears of Solomon, Mrs. Kilkannon's grey donkey? "Aye, 5 different kinds of disgust boiled up in Darby's throat as it almost strangled him. "Oh, you murdering, big-headed impostor!" he gasped. Half a minute after, a brown hoot owl, which was sheltered in a nearby blackthorn tree, called out to his brother's family, which inhabited the belfry of the chapel above on the hill, that some black-minded spalpeen had a hold of Solomon Kilcannon by the 2 ears and was kicking the ribs out of him, and that language the man was using to the poor beast was worse than scandalous. Although Darby couldn't understand what the owl was saying, he was startled by the blood-curdling hoot, and the same hoot saved Solomon from any further extraordinary trouncing, because as the Grangra man was stopped to hearken, there flashed on him the realization that he was baiting a cruel, multi-frightened, a blessing in disguise. For this same Solomon had the reputation of being the knowingest, sensiblest thing which walked on 4 legs in that parish, and he was a favourite with the young and old, especially with the children. And Mrs. Kilcannon said that she could talk to him as if he were a human, and she was sure he understood. And the face of them facts, the knowledgeable man changed his tune, and putting his arm friendly around the distressed animal's neck, he said, "But aren't you ashamed of yourself, Solomon, to be parading around and meandering around the churchyard Halloween night, disguising yourself this way as an outlandish ghost, and you having a fine reputation for decency and good manners and all?" he says, excusing himself. "I'm ashamed of you, so I am, Solomon," says he, hauling the beast about on the road and turning him till his head faced one more on the hillside. "Come back with me now to Curran McCarthy's, Averneen, and we've each been in worse company, I'm thinking. At least you have, Solomon," says Darby. At that, kind and friendly enough, the forgiving beast turned with Darby, and the two, keeping each other slithering company, went stumbling and scrambling up the hill toward the chapel. Now on the way, Darby kept up a one-sided conversation about all manner of things, so the ring of the human voice, even if it was only his own, would take a bit of the cruel lonesome out of the dark hedges and the wet and cloudy night. "Say, did you notice MacDonald's study as you came along the night, Solomon?" says Darby to the mule. "It must be roaring torrent by this time with the pouring rains, and we'll have to cross it," says he. "We could go over MacDonald's stone bridge that stands ferninst McCarthy's house, with only Nolan's meadow betwixt the two, but—" "Aye, yeah, we could do that, but," says Darby, laying a hand confidential on the ass's wet back, "'tis only a fortnight, isn't it, since the long Felix, the blind beggarman, fell from the same bridge and broke his neck, and what more natural," he asked, "than the ghost of Felix would be celebrating its first Halloween as a ghost at the spot where he was killed, right there on the bridge? Oh, yes, I don't think we should be going that way. Oh." Now, you may believe it or believe it not, but at them words, Solomon stopped dead and still in his tracks, and refused to go another step till Darby coaxed him on by saying, "Oh, then, if we won't cross if you're afeard, little man," he says to the donkey, "but we'll take the path through the fields on this side of it, and we'll cross the stream by McCarthy's own wooden footbridge. 'Tis 20 feet of the house, and you needn't be afeard," Darby says again. "I've seen the cows across it, so it'll surely hold both of us." And then a sudden remembrance whipped into his mind of how tall the stile was laden into Nolan's meadow, and the boy was puzzling deep in his mind to know how was Solomon to climb across that stile when all at once the gloomy western gate of the graveyard rose quick by their side. Now the two, Darby and beast alike, shied to the opposite hedge, and no wonder they did. 50 ghosts, all in their shrouds, sat cheek by jowl along that churchyard wall, never caring a hayport for the wind or the rain. There was little Ted Rogers, the humpback, who was drowned in Mullin's well 4 years come Michaelmas. There was Black Mulligan, the gamekeeper, who shot Ryan the poacher, sitting with a gun on his lap, and he glowering beside the gamekeeper sat the poacher with a jagged black hole in his forehead. And there was Thaddy Finnegan, the scholar, who was disappointed in love and died of a decline. And further on sat Mrs. Houlihan, who departed this life from eating of pies and mushrooms, and next to her sat 100 others. Now, not that Darby saw them, do you mind? He had too good sense to look that way at all. He walked with his head turned out to the open fields and his eyes squeezed shut, but something in his mind told him that they were there all the less, and he felt in the marrow of his very bones that if he gave them the encouragement of one glance, 2 or 3 would slip off the wall and come moaning over to tell him their troubles. What Solomon saw, And what Solomon heard as the two went shrinking along well will never be known to a living man, but once he gave a jump, and twice Darby felt him trembling, and when they reached at last the chapel wall, the beast broke into a swift trot, and pretty soon he galloped, and Darby went galloping along with him, till two yellow blurs of light across on the field to the left marked the windies of the Stonecutters' College. Just a few steps only then to the stile over in Nolan's meadow, and there the two stopped, each looking helpless at each other. Solomon had to be lifted, and there was the trouble. 3 times Darby tried by main strength to hoist his companion over the steps, but in vain, and Solomon was clean disgusted. Only for the tender corn on our hero's left little toe, I think maybe the length at last, the pair would have got safe over. The kind-hearted lad had the donkey's 2 little hoofs planted on the top step, and whilst he himself was lifting the rest of the beast in his arms, Solomon got a bit uneasy, you see, and he was going to be thrown, and he so began to twist and squirm, and of course as he did, Darby slipped and went thump down on his back against the stile, with Solomon sitting comfortable on top of the lad's chest. Oh, but that was not the worst of it, for as the beast scrambled up, he planted one hard little hoof on Darby's left foot, and the knowledgeable man let out a yell out of him that must have frightened all the ghosts within miles. Seeing that he'd done wrong, Solomon bolted for the middle of the road and stood there, wiry and attentive, listening to the names flung at him from where his late comrade sat on the lowest step of the stile, nursing his hurted foot. It was an excited owl in the belfry that this time spoke up and shouted to his brother down in the Blackhorn, "Ooh, ooh, come up, quick, ooh! Darby O'Gill is just after calling Solomon Kilcannon a malefactor, ooh!" Darby rose at last, and as he climbed over the stile, he turned to shake his fist toward the middle of the road. "Bad luck to you, you thick-headed, ungrateful informer. You go your way, and I'll go mine. Where's Sunders?" says he. And so saying, the crippled man went limping and grumbling down the boreen through the meadow, whilst his deserted friend set reproachful brays after him that would go to your heart. Now the throbbing of our hero's toe banished all pity for the beast, and even all thoughts of the banshee for the moment, until a long, gurgling, swooping sound in front told him that his fears about the rise of MacDonald's stream were under rather than over actual conditions. Fearing that the wooden footbridge might be swept away as it had been the year previous, Darby hurried on. Now, most times this little stream was only a quiet little brook that ran betwixt 2 purty green banks with hardly enough water in it to turn the broken wheel in Charter's ruined mill. But tonight it swept along angry and snarling, growling river that overleapt its banks and dragged wildly at the swaying willows. Being by an arrow throw of light from McCarthy's side window, our traveller could see the maddened weather striving and tearing to pull with the props of the little footbridge, and the boards shook and the centre swayed under his feet as he passed over that bridge. "But Dad, I'll not cross this way going home at any rate," Darby says, looking back at it. And the words were no sooner out of Darby's mouth than there was a crack, and the middle of the footbridge lifted in the air, twisted around for a second, then hurled itself into that stream, leaving the 2 ends still standing in their places on the banks. "Oh, thunder and turf!" Darby cried. "I mustn't forget to tell the people within of this, for if ever there was a trap set by evil spirits to drown a poor unwary mortal, there it stands. Oh, ain't a ghost terrible and vicious on Halloween?" And Darby stood there dripping a minute on the threshold listening, then, without knocking, and he lifted the latch and stepped softly into the house. The 2 candles burned above the blue and white chiny dishes on the table. A bright fire blazed on the hearth, and over in the corner where the low bed was set, the stonecutter was on his knees beside it. Eileen lay on her side, her shining eyes shielded out on the pillow, shining hair shielded out on the pillow. Her purty, flushed face was turned to McCormick, who knelt with his forehead behind the bed covers. The colleen's 2 little hands were clasped about the great fist of her husband, and she was talking low, but was so earnest that her whole life was in every word. "God save all here," said Darby, taking off his hat, but there was no answer. So deep were Cormac and Eileen in some conversation they were having together that they didn't hear Darby coming in. The knowledgeable man didn't know what to do now. He realized that a husband and a wife about to part forever were looking into each other's hearts for maybe the last time. And so Darby just stood there, shifting from one foot to the other, watching them, unable to depart and unable to protrude. "Oh, it isn't death at all that I fear," Eileen was saying. No, Cormac Astor. 'Tis not that I misdoubtful of, but, call me of Roan. 'Tis you I fear, Cormac, 'tis you." Now the kneeling man gave one swift upward glance and drew his face nearer to the sick wife. She went on then, spaking tender and half smiling and stroking his hand. I know, darling, I know well, so you needn't tell me that if I were to live with you 1,000 years, you'd never stray in mind or thought to any other woman. And but it's when I'm gone, when the lonesome evenings follow each other through days and months and maybe years, and you sitting there at this fireside without one to speak to, and you so handsome and grand, and with a penny or two we put away. Oh, Storylink McClee, why can't you banish them black thoughts? Says the stonecutter. Maybe, he says, maybe the Banshee will not come again, and ain't all the countryside praying for you this night, and didn't Father Cassidy himself bid you to hope? The saints in heaven couldn't be so cruel. But the colleen went on as though she hadn't heard him, or as if he had not interrupted her at all. And listen, says Eileen, they'll come urging you, Cormac, the neighbours and Raisden with you. Your own flesh and blood will come, and no doubt me own with them, and they'll be striving to push me out of your heart and put another woman there in my place. I'll know it all, but I won't be able to call to you, Cormac McClee, for I'll be lying silent under the grass or under the snow behind the church. Now, while she was saying them last words, although Darby's heart was melting for poor Eileen, his mind began running over the colleens of that townland to pick out the one who'd most likely marry Cormac in the end. You know how far-seeing and quick-minded was this knowledgeable man. He settled sudden on the Hanlon girl, and decided at once that she'd have Cormac before the year was out. And the audacity of such a thing made Darby furious at her. Darby says to himself, half crying, Why then, bad cess to you for a shameless red-haired forward baggage, Bridget O'Hanlon, to be running after the man and throwing himself in his way, and Eileen not yet cold in her grave, says Darby. While he was saying them things to himself, McCarthy had been whispering fierce to his wife, but what it was the stonecutter said, the friend of the fairies couldn't hear. Eileen herself spoke clean enough in answer, for the favour gave her unnatural strength. And don't think, she says, that it's the first time this thought has come to me. 2 months ago, when I was strong and well and sitting happy as a meadowlark at your side, the same black shadow drifted over me heart. The worst of it and the hardest to bear of it all is that they'll be in the right, Cormac, they'll be in the right. For what good can I do for you when I'm under the clay? Says she. Oh, it's different with a woman. If you were taken and I was left, I'd wear your face in my heart through all my life and ask for no sweeter company. Eileen, says Cormac, lifting his hand, and his voice was hoarse as the roar of day, I swear to you, on me bended knees. No, with her hand on his lips, Eileen stopped him from swearing whatever it was he was going to swear. There'll come on ye by degrees a great craving for sympathy, a hunger and a longing for affection. You're just a man, and you'll have only the shadows of my poor vanished face to comfort you, and a recollection of a voice that's gone forever. A new warm face will keep pushing itself betwixt us. Aye, bad luck to that red-headed hussy, muttered Darby under his breath, looking around distressed. I'll warn Father Cassidy of her and the intentions on the day after the funeral. There was silence for a minute, and Cormac, the poor lad, was sobbing like a child. By and by Eileen went on again, but her voice was failing, and Darby could see that her cheeks were wet. The day'll come when you'll give over, Eileen says. I see how it'll end. After that you'll visit the churchyard by stealth, so as not to make the other woman sore-hearted again me. Oh my, isn't she the far-seeing woman, thought Darby. And then the little childer'll come, Eileen says, and their soft warm arms will hold you away, and by you'll not go where I'm laid at all, and all thoughts of these few happy months we've spent together. Oh, Mother in heaven, how happy they were. And the girl started to her elbow, for a sharp and sudden wild wailing cry just outside the window startled the shuddering darkness. It was a long cry of terror and of grief, not shrill, but piercing as a knife thrust. Every hair on Darby's head stood up and pricked him like a needle. 'Twas the Banshee. Shh, listen, says Eileen. Oh, Cormac Astor, coming for me again. And with that, stiff with terror, Eileen buried herself under the pillows. A second cry followed the first, only this time was longer and rose and swelled into a kind of song that broke at last into the heartbreakingest moan that ever fell on mortal ears. Cold, it sobbed. The knowledgeable man, his blood turned to ice, his legs trembling like a hare, stood and looking in spite of himself at the black window panes, expecting some frightful vision. And after that second cry, the voice balanced itself up and down into the awful death keen, and one word made the whole song, and that terrible word was forever, forever and ever, forever. Swung the wild queen keen, until all the deep meaning of the word burned itself into Darby's soul, the heartbreaking sob. Oh, cold and dead was all the worse. Now Darby was just wondering whether he himself wouldn't go mad with fright, when he gave a sudden jump at a hard, strained voice which spoke at his very elbow. Darby O'Gill, it said. It was a stonecutter who spoke. Do you hear the death keen? It came last night. It'll come tomorrow night at the same hour, and then, oh my God. Darby tried to answer, but he could only stare at the white, set face and the sunken eyes of the man standing before him. There was, too, a kind of fierce quiet in the way McCarthy spoke that made Darby shiver. The stonecutter went on talking the same as though he was going to drive a bargain. They say you're a knowledgeable man, Darby O'Gill, and not on a time you spent 6 months with the fairies. Now I make you this square offer, says he, laying a forefinger in the palm of his other hand. I have £53 that Father Cassidy's keeping for me. £53, he says again. And I have this good bit of a farm that my father was born upon, and his father was born on, and two and the grandfather of him. And I have a grass of 7 cows. You know that, Darby. But Darby, I'll give it all to you. Every stiver of it. If you'll only go outside and drive away that cursed singing banshee. He threw his head to one side and he looked up anxious at Darby. The knowledgeable man racked his brains for something to speak, but all he could say was, I brought you a bit of tea from the wife, Cormac. McCarthy took the tea with unfeeling hands and went on talking the same dull way, only this time there came a hard lump in his throat now and that he had stopped to swallow. The 3 cows I have go with it, of course, with the farm. So does the pony and the 5 pigs. I have a good plough and a fine harrow, but you must leave my stone-cutting tools right, so little Eileen and I can earn our way wherever we go, and it's the little creature hates at the best of times. The man's eyes were dry and blazing. No doubt his mind was cracked with grief. There was a lump in Darby's throat, too, but for all that he spoke up scolding-like. Talk reason, man, Darby says, putting 2 hands on Cormac's shoulders. If I had the wit or the art to banish a banshee, wouldn't I be happy to do it for not a farthing to pay? Well then, says Cormac, scowling and pushing Darby to one side, I'll just go face her myself. I'll face her and I'll choke that song in her throat if Satan himself stood at her side. And with those words, and before Darby could stop him, the stonecutter flung open the door and plunged out into the night. As he did so, the song outside stopped. Suddenly a quick splash in feet, hoarse cries and shouts gave it tidings of a chase, and the half-crazed gossoon had started up the banshee, and that there could be no manner of doubt. A remembrance of the awful things that she might do to his friend petrified the heart of Darby. And as I mentioned, we're running a little late. Probably, 12 minutes more. I hope you can stay with us. Even after these cries died away, he stood listening for a full minute. The soles of his 2 brogues glued to the floor. The only sound he heard now were the deep ticking of a clock and a cricket that chirped slow and solemn on the hearth. And from somewhere outside there came the sorrowful cry of a whippoorwill. All at once, a thought of the broken bridge and the black treacherous waters caught him like a blow of a whip, and for a second drove from his mind even the fear of the banshee. In that 1 second, and before he realized it, Darby was out under the dripping trees and running for his life toward the broken bridge. The night was whirling and beating above him and flapping tremendous wings, but as Darby thought he heard above the rush of the water and through the swish of wind and Cormac's voice crawling. The friend of the fairy stopped at the edge of the footbridge to listen. Although the storm had almost passed, a spiteful flare of lightning leapt up now and again out of the western hills, and after it came the dull rumble of distant thunder. The water splashed spitefully against the bank, and Darby saw that the 7 good feet of the bridge had been torn out of its centre, leaving uncovered that much of the black deep flood. He stood straining his eyes and ears in wonderation, for now the voice of Cormac sounded from the other side of the stream, seeming to be floating toward him through the field over the path Darby himself had just travelled, from the other side of the stream. At first he was mildly bewildered at what might bring Cormac on the other side of that brook, till all at once the murdering scheme of the banshee burst in his mind like a gunpowder explosion. Her plan was as plain as day. She meant to drown the stonecutter. She had led the poor distracted man straight from his own door down to and over the new stone bridge, and was now deluding him on the other side of the stream, back again up the path that led to the broken footbridge. In the glare of a sudden blinding flash from the middle of the sky, Darby saw a sight he'll never forget to the day he dies. Cormac the stonecutter was running toward the death trap, his bared head thrown back, his two arms stretched out in front of him, a little above and just out of reach of them. Plain and clear as Darby ever saw his wife Bridget was the misty white figure of a woman. Her long waving hair trailed back from her face, and her face was the face of the dead. At the sight of her, Darby tried to call out a warning, but the words fell back into his throat. Then again came the stifling darkness. He tried to run away, but his knees failed him, so he turned around to face the danger. As he did so, he could hear the splash of the man's feet in the soft mud. In less than a minute, Cormac would be struggling in the water. At the thought, Darby braced himself body and soul, let a warning howl out of him. "Hold where you are! She wants to drown ye! The bridge is broke! The bridge is broke in the middle!" But he could tell from the rushing footsteps and from the hoarse, swelling curses which came nearer him near every second, the deluded man, crazed with grief, was deaf and blind to everything but the figure that floated before his eyes. At that hopeless instant, Bridget's parting words popped into Darby's head. "When one goes on an errand of mercy, Darby, a score of God's white angels," had said Bridget, "with swords in their hands, and march before and beside and after him, keeping his path free from danger." Now, how it all came to pass, Darby could never rightly tell, for he was like a man in a dream, but he recollects well, standing on the broken end of the bridge, Bridget's words ringing in his ears, the glistening black gulf beneath his feet, and he swinging his arms for a jump. Just one thought of himself and the children, and he gathered himself for a spring, and he cleared the gap like a bird. Yes, as Darby's 2 feet touched the other side of the gap, a terrific screech, not a screech either, but an angry, frightened shriek, almost split his ears. He felt a rush of cold, dead air against his face, and he caught a whiff of newly turned clay in his nostrils, and something white stopped quick before him, and then with a second shriek, it shot high in the darkness and disappeared. Darby had frightened the wits out of the Banshee. The instant after, the two men were clinched and rolling over each other down on the muddy bank, their legs splashing as far as the knees into the dangerous water, and McCarthy raining weak blows on the knowledgeable man's head and breast. Darby felt himself going into the river. Bits of the bank caved under him, splashing into the current, and the lad's heart began clunking up and down like a churn dash. "Lave off of me! Lave off!" he cried, as soon as he could catch his breath. "Do you take me for a banshee, eh?" says he, giving a desperate lurch and rolling himself on top of the other. "Who are you, then? If you're not a ghost, you're the devil at any rate," gasped the stonecutter. "Bad luck to ye!" cried Darby, clasping both arms of the haunted man. "I'm no ghost, let alone the devil. I'm only your friend, Darby O'Gill, eh?" Lying there breathing hard, they stared into the faces of each other a little space until the poor stonecutter began to cry. Is that you, Darby O'Gill? There's the Banshee. Haven't I the bad fortune?" he says, trying to raise himself. "Rise up, man," says Darby, lifting the man to his feet and steadying him there. The stonecutter stared about him like one stunned by a blow. "I don't know where the Banshee flew off to, but do you go back to Eileen as soon as you can," says the friend of the fairies. "Not that way, man alive," he says, as Cormac started to climb the footbridge. "It's broke in the middle, man. Go down and cross the stone bridge. I'll be after you in a minute." Without a word, meek now and biddable as a child, Cormac turned, and Darby saw him hurry away into the blackness. Now, the reasons that Darby remained behind were two. First and foremost, he was a bit vexed at the way his clothes were muddied and draggled, and he himself had been pounded and hammered. And second, he wanted to think. He had a queer, cold feeling in his mind that something was wrong, a kind of foreboding, one might say. As he stood thinking, a realization of calamity struck him all at once like a rap on the jaw. He had lost his fine briar pipe. The lad had groaned as he began the anxious search. He slapped furiously at his chest and his side pockets. He dived into the trousers and greatcoat, and at last, sprawling on his hands and feet like a monkey, he groped savagely through the wet and sticky clay. "This comes," says the poor lad, grumbling and groping, "of poking your nose in other people's business." Hello, what's this?" he says, straightening himself. "'Tis a comb, by the powers of pewter. It's the Banshee's comb." And so indeed it was. Darby had picked up a gold comb the length of your hand and almost the width of your 2 fingers. About an inch of one end of it was broken off and then dropped into Darby's palm. Without thinking, he put the broken bit into his waistcoat pocket and he raised the biggest half close to his eyes, the better to view it. And for those of you here in the Glen NSL, the clever ones, you may search about and find that very same comb sitting somewhere. May I never see sorrow, he says, if the banshee must have dropped her comb. Look at that now. Folks do be saying that this gives her the fine singing voice because the comb is enchanted, Darby says. If that saying be true, it's a famous lad I am from this night. I'll travel from fair to fair, and maybe at the end they'll send me to Parliament. With these words, Darby lifted his caubeen and stuck the comb in the top tuft of his hair. Yes, there was a comb here in the Kitely Glen too, but someone ran off with it. We'll find one for next week. Begor. Darby had no sooner given it a pull than a sour, singing feeling began at the bottom of his stomach, and it rose higher and higher. And when it reached his chest, he was just going to let a bawl out of himself, only that he caught sight of a thing ferninst him that froze the marrow in his bones. Of course you did, Dagmar. He gasped, though. Surprised Rick didn't beat you to it. He gasped short and jerked the comb out of his hair, for there, not 10 feet away, stood a dark and shadowy woman, tall, thin, and motionless, leaning on a crutch. Now, during a breath or two, the persecuted hero lost his head completely, for he never doubted that the banshee had changed her suit of clothes to chase back after him. The first clear emotion that returned to him was to fling the comb on the ground and make a bolt of it. But on second thought, he knew that it would be easier to beat the wind in a race than to run away from the banshee. Well, there's a good Tipperary man done for this time, groaned the knowledgeable man, unless in some way I can beguile her. Now, Darby was fishing his mind for its civilest word when a woman spoke up, and Darby's heart jumped in gladness as he recognized the cracked voice of Sheila Maguire, the spy for the fairies. "Top of the evening to you, Darby," says Sheila, peering at him from under her hood, the 2 eyes of her glowing like tallow candles. "Amn't I killed with astonishment to see you here alone this time of night?" says the old witch. Now, the clever man knew as well as though he had been told that when Sheila said them words that the banshee had sent her to look for the comb, and his heart grew bold, but he answered her polite enough. "Why then, luck to you, Mistress Maguire, ma'am," Darby says, bowing grand. "Sure, if you're killed with astonishment, and I split with incredulity to find yourself meandering in this lonesome place on Halloween night." Sheila hobbled a step or two nearer and whispered confidential like. "Well, I's wandering hereabouts only this morning," she says, "and I lost from me hair a gold comb. I lost it, I did, one that I've had these 40 years. Did you see such a thing as that, agra?" And her 2 eyes blazed. "Faye, I don't know. Maybe you should ask Dagmar or Zaphod," says Darby, putting his 2 arms behind him. "Was it about the length of your hand and the width of your 2 fingers?" he asked. "It was," says Sheila, thrusting out a withered paw. "Oh, then I didn't find it," says the tantalized man. "But maybe I did find something similar, only it wasn't yours at all." "Wasn't yours at all, Sheila Maguire, but the Banshees." Now, whether the hag was intentioned to wilt Darby with her staff, or whether she was only lifting it to make sign of enchantment in the air, will never be known. But whatsoever she meant, the hero doubled his fists and squared off. At that, she lowered the stick and broke into a shrill and cackling laugh. She laughed, holding her sides. "But aren't ye the bold and distinguishable man, Because, of course it is the Banshees come out, well, you know it. By the same token, I'm sent to bring it away. So make haste to give it up, Darby O'Gill, for she's hiding and waiting for me down at Charter's Mill. Aren't you the courageous blackguard to gravel at her and try to catch her? Shoo, such a thing never happened before since the world began," says Sheila. Now, the idea that the Banshee was hiding and feared to face him was great news to the hero. But he only tossed his head and smiled superior as he made answer. "'Tis yourself that knows well, Sheila Maguire, ma'am," answers back the proud man, slow and deliberate, "that when one does a favour for an unearthly spirit, he may demand for pay the favours of 3 such wishes as the spirit has the power to give. The world knows that. Now I'll take 3 good wishes, such as the Banshee can bestow, or else I'll carry the golden comb straight to Father Cassidy. The Banshee hasn't gold nor worldly goods, as the saying is, but she has what suits me better. Now this cleverness angered the fairy woman, so she sent in to abuse and to frighten Darby. She ballyragged, she browbait, she traduced, she threatened, but 'twas no use. The bold man hilt firm until at last she promised him the favours of 3 wishes from the Banshee. Good, then. First and foremost, says Darby, I want her never to put her spell on me or any of my kith and kin. Aye, that wish she gives you, that wish she grants you, though it'll go sore agin the grain, snarled Sheila. Then, says Darby, my second wish is that the black spell be taken off of Eileen McCarthy. Sheila flushed around like an angry hen. Wouldn't something else do as well, she says. I'm not here to argify, says Darby, swinging back and forth on his toes. Bad screen to you, says Sheila. I'll have to go and ask the Banshee about that. Don't start from that spot until I come back, men. We're getting really close, really. Now, you may believe it or not, but with that saying, she bent her head on her crutch well forward, and before Darby's very face she threw, saving your presence, one leg over the stick as though it had been a horse, and while one might say Jack Robinson, the crouch rose into the air and lifted her, and she went sailing out of sight. Darby, well, don't let the Banshee know you've got it, Asnana. Darby was still gaping and gawping at the darkness when she disappeared, when whisk, she was back again and dismounting at his side. The luck is with ye, says Sheila, spiteful. That wish I give you, that wish I grant you. You'll find 7 crossed rushes under McCarthy's doorstep. Uncross them, put them in fire, in water, and the spell is lifted. Be quick with the 3rd wish. Out with it. Well, I'm in a more particular hurry about that than you are, says Darby. You must find me briar pipe, says he. You overdone, sneered the fairy woman. 'Tis stuck in the band of your hat where you put it when you left your own house that night. No, not in front, she says as Darby put his hand to feel. It's stuck in the back. Your carbines twisted. Now, whilst Darby was standing there with the comb in one hand and his pipe in the other, smiling delighted, the comb was snatched from his fingers, and he got a welt to the side of the head from the crutch. Looking up, he saw Sheila 20 feet in the air, heading for Charter's Mill, and she cackling and screeching with laughter. Rubbing his sword head and muttering unpious words to himself, Darby started for the new bridge. In less than no time after, he had found the 7 crossed rushes under McCarthy's doorstep and had flung them into the stream. And then, without knocking, he pushed open McCarthy's door and tiptoed quietly in. Cormac was kneeling beside the bed with his face buried in the pillows, as he was when Darby first saw him that night. But Eileen was sleeping as sound as a child, with a sweet smile upon her lips. Heavy perspiration beaded her forehead, showing that her favour was broke. Without disturbing either of them, our hero picked up the package of tea from the floor, put it on the dresser, and with a glad heart strolled out of the house and closed the door softly behind him. Turning towards Charter's Mill, he lifted his hat and bowed low. But thank you kindly, Mistress Banshee, he says. 'Tis well for us all I found your comb this night, public or private. I'll always say this for you. You're a woman of your... Aye? Oh. You're a woman of your word. Well, what's this in my pocket? And that's where our story ends for the night.